Okay, sure. So hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for those of you for joining us today for the Global Evaluation Week and for the event, How Relevant is Relevance. I'm Ashrita Saran. I'm the Director of Research at the Research and Evaluation Center, REC, and I've been working in the evidence synthesis space for over a decade now. I wear several hats. I was previously the founding executive director for Campbell South Asia, have been associated with Campbell Collaboration for different work, but currently working as a director of research at REC. And I think before we begin, I would like to provide some context about the organizers here. So Research and Evaluation Center, or REC, is a global network of research associates and policy associates. The team here at REC is highly experienced in conducting different types of evidence synthesis, including systematic reviews, evidence and gap map, rapid reviews, mixed methods, and qualitative reviews. At REC, we're also deeply committed to diversity and inclusion, and we support the career development of early career professionals, specifically those from disadvantaged backgrounds in Asia and Africa. And we achieve this by training researchers in something called as learning by doing model, particularly focusing on African and Asian researchers and involving them in conducting high quality and policy oriented research and evaluation in social and economic policy areas. For example, REC has produced rapid evidence synthesis reports for the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office under its Rapid Evidence Synthesis Services. We also provide strategic advice to Youth Future Foundation and also a current supporter and convener in the third Summer Evaluation Bootcamp at Lanzhou University, which will take place in June 2025. I would now like to introduce our co-organizers, which is the Center for Evidence-Based Social Sciences at Lanzhou University, which was established in 2017. Center for Evidence-Based Social Sciences is China's first academic institution which is dedicated to evidence-based social sciences. The center again has a multidisciplinary team that integrates resources from fields such as evidence-based medicine, law, economics, management, education, library and information sciences, and sociology. They have published over 10 books in their evidence-based social sciences series, offered 10 courses, and conducted 13 workshops for over 1,000 trainees across 20 provinces in China. And together, both of these organizations, they are dedicated to advancing evidence-based practices and fostering a collaborative environment for research and evaluation. I would encourage you all to utilize this opportunity to ask questions during the session. You can use the Q&A feature in the chat to ask your question, but I would suggest and recommend that you use the Q&A feature to ask your question during the sessions, and the questions will be taken up as during the end of the discussion. Now, I would like to hand it over to Professor Howard White, who is the Professor of Evidence-Based Public Policy at the Center for Evidence-Based Social Sciences and also the co-founder at REC, to continue the session. Dr. White, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Ashrita, and welcome everybody to this session on how relevant is relevant. So I'm going to be starting off with the presentation and then handing over to my colleagues who have also been involved in the work, and they'll introduce themselves as they come along. So let me share my slides again. Those who came early, I was doing that earlier, but I stopped a moment ago. Hopefully it's this one. Okay, hopefully you can see that, and it's in screen sharing mode already, so we're good to go. Except it's not moving. There we go. So the background on this talk is that we're looking at the DAC criteria of relevance. So for those of you that don't know, the DAC is the Development Assistance Committee of the OECD. It was set up originally called Development Assistance Group when it was originally founded in 1960, but in 1961 it became the DAC. And the DAC is like a donors club overseeing aid management, aid performance. As a bit of history, UNCTAD tried to play that role at the same time, but the donors wanted to set up an organization that they controlled, that only had them be in charge of aid management, rather than leave it to a UN organization in which developing countries were represented. That's another story for another time. And so the DAC has various working groups, which includes an evaluation working group, which maybe some people in the call are involved in. And back in 1991, so that's what, 34 years ago now, the DAC established a set of evaluation criteria, which started to become widely used by a number of international organizations in their evaluations. In 2018, 2019, they undertook a consultation to revise these criteria, and the new criteria were published in 2019. And we're going to look at those 6 criteria in a moment with 2 underlying principles. One is that you're meant to think about the criteria when you apply them. Like, they shouldn't just be like, okay, like a checkbox exercise, and that's sort of the motivation for doing this piece of work. And then, of course, how you apply them, the relevance of each particular criterion to a particular evaluation depends on the purpose of the evaluation questions. So the new criteria, they're not so new anymore, they've been in place since 2016, but the new criteria are 6 of them. So the relevance is the first one that's normally considered, and we're going to be talking about that in more detail during this talk. Coherence is a new one. So there used to be 5 criteria, and the one that was added was coherence, which is mainly about not having everyone do the same thing, then people leaving out other stuff. So you coordinate what you're doing with other development agencies and, of course, with the government and other development actors in country, and with, of course, indigenous efforts by people in the country as well. You've got here both effectiveness and impact. So impact used to be there talking about the long run outcomes. And for those familiar with impact evaluation debates, you'll be aware that this word impact has 2 meanings. It's something I've written about in other papers some years ago now. So impact in a log frame approach, for people with an M&E background, impact is what comes after outcomes. So I have inputs, activities, outputs, individual outcomes, final outcomes, then impact. So it's like a long run welfare measure. Whereas when you use the word impact in the term impact evaluation, it just means what difference the intervention make. And it could be the level of outputs, it could be the level of outcomes. And so this conflation or 2 meanings of the word, 2 meanings of the word impact cause confusion when they're conflated, which they often are. So DAC sort of fudged this issue because they switched the definition of impact to what difference the intervention makes. And if you read the full definition, it includes long run outcomes as well, and unintended outcomes, and so on, which were in the previous definition. But they also have effectiveness. And effectiveness is the intervention achieving its outcomes, objectives, which it's different in that it's about objectives on intended outcomes, so it ignores unintended outcomes. And it's different, the way it's interpreted often different because people look at just outcome monitoring, regardless of whether that's because of the program or not. So to me, the impact effectiveness definition of that criteria is a bit of a fudge. I mean, it's not really satisfactory. Efficiency is around cost effectiveness and so on. It's good to have that there. A lot of evaluations don't consider that. And then sustainability, will the benefits last or not? So they're the 6 criteria. And we're going to focus now in particular on relevance. So for each of the 6 criteria, there's an overall one line summary of what it is, which is the intervention doing the right things? And then there's the old definition and the new definition. And the main change here actually is the last words of the new definition about whether whether it's doing the right thing, even if priorities change. And so the need for programs to adapt to changing circumstances. That wasn't in the old definition. And that's the main change you see here. You notice that it's relevant, is doing the right thing, aligning with the needs and priorities, and focus on needs and priorities, we'll come back to that, of beneficiaries. so it says beneficiaries there, as well as national, so the country or the government, and they conflate those two, and we've done that here. But I've been looking at our work. I think maybe we should separate out country and government. I'll come back to that. Global priorities and partner priorities, other agencies you're working with, which may be either national agencies or development partners. So it's like relevant to who in both the old and the new definition. In the new definition, it says partners, institutions, so rather than just partners. Okay, moving on. So during the consultations in 2018, when the criteria being revised, the consultations raised two concerns around relevance. So it was felt that relevance was one of the most best implemented of the existing old five criteria. But two concerns were raised. The second one is this issue of not adapting to changing circumstances, and we'll mention that a bit. But the first one, which is also our main focus here, is it was rather what they called shallowly addressed as an alignment with policies and strategies. And what was meant by that will be seen in the coming slides because it's our main focus as well. So my motivation for starting this work and asking my colleagues to join me in doing this study was a general feeling that there's quite a low bar on relevance. So I work in evidence synthesis, and that means I read a lot of evaluations. And I've been working in evaluations my whole career, so it's over 30 years now. And so I've seen a lot of evaluations, done a lot of evaluations. And when I was working in the World Bank Evaluation Department, we used to review all the completion reports that were done. So I got to see how they were applying the criteria, because the the World Bank project completion reports, now called implementation completion results reports, they use the DAC criteria. So I got to see how they're being applied. And I felt relevance was being applied by a rather low bar. And again, I'll explain that in examples in the coming slides. So, and it comes from three anecdotes, which I'm going to go through now. So just recently, I read this book that's come out just this year by Mark Lowcock and Renil Dissanayake. And Mark Lowcock was the permanent secretary of DFID for many years and a senior civil servant in its predecessor, ODA, before that. And he was one of the instrumental players in introducing the international development targets, which were the predecessors of the MDGs. And so the IDTs came in the sort of late 90s and they got replaced in 2000 by MDGs. And so clearly he was someone who's a strong supporter of this target-based approach to development, having clear explicit goals and targets at the outcome level. But if you read the book, he's quite skeptical about moves to SDGs. I was also quite involved in the IDT's MDGs. I wrote a book on the MDGs. And when it came to the SDGs, I sort of felt the same way. And this was the target proliferation that happened. So there are 8 goals, 21 targets, 63 indicators in the MDGs, which are already more than the IDTs had. The SDGs, the number of goals, more than doubled. It just went from 8 to 17. The number of targets went up nearly eightfold from 21 to 169, and number of indicators went up fourfold from 63 to 248. So you've got this proliferation. And what Mark Lowcock says explicitly in the book is, once everything is a priority, then nothing's a priority. So the idea of the MDGs was, let's identify the priority goals: under 5 mortality, poverty, okay, gender empowerment. Let's focus on those and try to get those included. Whereas the SDGs went for what's often called a Christmas tree approach, which is basically everyone gets to it's called that because everyone gets to hang a decoration on the tree. So everyone got to include something. Everyone wanted their thing to be included in SDGs. So everything there, so everything's included, everything's a priority. Everything's a priority and nothing's a priority. This reminded me of an incident very early in my career. So in the mid-80s, I worked in the planning office in Lesotho as a planning officer. And we didn't plan a lot because all the capital budget was funded through donor projects. So what we did was negotiate with donors around the projects, and not a lot of negotiation goes on either, because the donor says, here we're going to do this project, and you say, fine, okay, to come to this project, and there's not a lot goes on in terms of what you can tell them to do and not to do. One exception is the European Union, because the European Union, under the Lomé Convention and other different agreements, but mainly Lomé Convention at the time, had to give a certain amount of money to Lesotho. Had to do it. Had to give this much euros, wasn't euros at the time, but this much money to Lesotho, and they had to get agreement to how they were going to spend that money, and so they actually had less bargaining power because they had to get the agreement with the government of how that money would be spent. So the government got, actually, unusually, some say in influencing a donor on how it was going to spend its money. And in the planning office, we'd gone around our different ministries, asked us in trade industry and tourism, gone around different ministries asking, well, what do you want? And we got a long shopping list of projects from every sector, because everyone got a turn to be on the list. And when it came to negotiations with the European Union, they came and they were presented this long list of projects from every sector, and they said, no, we want to just focus on the country priority sector. And the permanent secretary, who was leading negotiations from our side, from the government of Lesotho side, said quite openly in this opening stage of negotiations, everything is a priority. So as the European Union realised, when everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. That matters because obviously, if you're going to say, "Oh, a program's relevant," if it's a priority, but everything is a priority, then everything is relevant. So it becomes quite a meaningless threshold or criterion to apply. So a couple of years ago now, 3 years ago now, friend and colleague of mine, Sonia Cavallo, was leading the annual results and performance report that's being done every year by the World Bank. And I was part of the team working with Sonia on this. And for the first time, the RAP was being done looking at the country level rather than the project level. So we're doing an assessment of country policy frameworks. And so we're looking at relevance of country policy frameworks and how it's been assessed. And what we found was relevance was undermined by lack of selectivity. So country policy frameworks suffered from the same problem. So World Bank's going to go into a country and basically going to work in every sector. It's not going to identify genuine priority sectors, genuine bottlenecks to development of that country. And so, okay, here are the priority bottlenecks to development. We should work on those with government. No, we're going to do health, education, climate change, water supply, agricultural development, youth employment, secondary education, or tertiary education too, because no one else does that. It's going to do everything. Okay, and so there's a lack of selectivity. Everything is a priority, and when everything's a priority, it becomes hard to be selective. You need to really think about, okay, what really is a priority. The last example, this is my favorite one, is so back there the cartoon shows when everything's just saying it's a priority is a real low bar. So when you've got such a low bar, everything is relevant. And so the example we've got is not a developing country example, it's youth employment in Scotland. So there was a European Union initiative called the Youth Employment Initiative. And across the European Union, and this time the UK was still in the European Union, across the European Union, then regions could get money for youth employment programs. And this was around 2012, so over 10 years ago, still the aftermath of the 2008, 2009 economic crisis. So unemployment was generally high. Youth unemployment is usually higher than overall unemployment. So youth unemployment is high, particularly high in depressed regions. And so it was a priority issue. Actually, the government of Scotland, so we have a devolved system in the UK, so Scotland has its own government. The government of Scotland had a development strategy in which youth employment was indeed one of the pillars in that development strategy. So it was a priority. So on the low bar of, is it a priority? Is it a problem? Is it a priority? Yes, it's relevant. But what did the government of Scotland want to do to address this problem? the government of Scotland said, we want to include entrepreneurship training at higher in tertiary education courses. So in university level courses, we'll have tertiary education. And the European Union said, no, tertiary education is not eligible. You can't do that. So, okay, the government said, well, we've got this National Skills Agency in Scotland, and it wants to do a wage subsidy program. And so we can use the money from the Youth Employment Initiative to expand that scheme. And the European Union said, no, not allowed. You can only do schemes that are focused in the areas we've chosen for you as being the most disadvantaged. One of the things the European Union does is has regions called NUTS, I forget what it stands for, which don't correspond to any domestic political boundaries, and programs have to fall within these NUTS areas that the European Union's defined and don't overlap with domestic district boundaries or council boundaries or anything like that. So you had to in these particular NUTS regions identified by the European Union. So then Scott said, okay, fine, okay. Well, it's quite obvious that children, young people, children that leave school early, get excluded from school, they're most risk from unemployment. The data are very clear on that. So we want to try and prevent school dropout. So we want to take a preventive approach. So we're going to identify children at risk of dropping out of school, keep them in school, work on entrepreneurial skills, and find them a pathway into employment. The European Union said, no, you can't do that. You can only use this money to help for children who've already become unemployed. And so the government of Scotland identified 3 different things that it wanted to do, but none of those were acceptable to the European Union. And so if you ask to set the bar for relevance at what does the government actually want to do? What do beneficiaries want? That's a much higher bar than, oh, just wasn't a priority. Youth Employment Initiative in Scotland, high priority project appears relevant by those criteria, by that criterion. But if you say, was it doing what the government wanted to do to tackle youth employment? No, really not, because everything the government came with, the European Union said, no, you can't use the money for that. It's not got it on the slide, but the evaluation of the programme said, look, really, the centre should just set the high-level outcomes, like reduce youth unemployment, and let the local government decide how it wants to use that money, which would be what we know from development programs if I'd looked at those and the move to decentralisation, community-driven development, and so on. So in this project, with this feeling that, well, there's this low bar out there and people are assessing relevance against this really low bar, we decided to look at 4 agencies, ILO, UNDP, UNICEF, and the World Bank, where we're looking at the completion reports prepared by the operational department. The evaluation department doesn't do project level evaluations. And they all use for DAC criteria, and we're going to see how they apply, how they assess relevance. We're going to look at 40 from each agency. We're going to look at 20 from 2013, 20 from 2023. So 2023, so it's long enough now that they've got them all up on the website already. And we look at 2 points in time, so we can see if it's the way in which relevance being assessed has changed over time. And we did some piloting. We read through some of the studies, and the approach we're using is informed by doing systematic reviews. All the people working on this project have worked on reviews, or looking on reviews now, and so we're informed by an approach from reviews, which is coding documents, extracting data from documents and coding it. And we always, when we're doing a review, we do some piloting to read the documents and get a sense of what's in there, and that helps developing our coding framework. And we've got here a very simple coding framework. We're planning to do some more work here. So if anything, any suggestions in the audience of things we might do to deepen the analysis, please do let us know. So we've got 3 categories here, and yeah, okay, still me. Relevant to who? So the top 4 of those come from the definition. Beneficiaries, global, it says country, or in the old definition national, but the new one country, and we put country stroke government. I no longer think they're the same thing, because when you read the contents, which I've done when we're playing presentation, they actually, some are country, some are government, and I think we should in our revisions of work we've done distinguish those 2, even though they're one, they're the same in the criteria. Local partners or institutions, so other agencies, The funding agency is not in the definition, but it comes up in relevance criteria. People say, well, it's relevant to us. It's relevant to us, the funder. And when I was aware of this because I've read a lot of World Bank studies, and they tend to do it. But we found other agencies do it as well. And I first thought, well, you shouldn't do that. I think if you only do that, if it's only relevant to you, then it's a bad thing. But because most studies have multiple relevance claims, then actually I think it's fine to say it's aligned with your own. So, like, take for example the World Bank, we looked at the country policy frameworks. Yeah, it makes sense to say, is this intervention in line with our own country policy framework? So it's not a bad thing, but it's not in the DAC criteria. And so one question we have is, well, should the DAC criteria be revised? In one way would be to include funder, relevance to funder as part of the relevance assessment. The second is what we call specificity. So this is how clear is the evidence claim in terms of how specific is it? So it could just say, oh, this program aligned with government priority policies. And they do that. Or they could actually cite they could say that it aligns with government health policy, education policy, but not name a particular policy. Or they could say this aligns with the country's national aid strategy, for example, in capital letters, meaning it means a particular strategy, and maybe give a reference to that document. So there's saying, okay, it's in line with this particular policy, and that's a higher level specificity. The more specific still would be to give particular details. So to say the national aid strategy is targeted on a preventive approach of condom distribution amongst high risk groups, for example. And so then it says that this program supports a social marketing scheme for condoms, and it's targeting, including social marketing in high risk groups, showing a very specific detail of what we're doing and how that fits with the strategy. So it's really okay. This is, if you think back to the Scottish example, they wanted youth wage subsidy, and we're funding youth wage subsidy. They didn't, but suppose they had done, that would have been like specific details of alignment. So this is where the bar gets higher. In the relevant to who, there's no bar there. It's just relevant to different people, unless it says only relevant to the funder. Then I think that's a low bar. But otherwise, there's no bar there. But here, there's clearly a bar. The bar's getting higher. The more specific is the relevance claim. And finally, is the basis for the claim. Now, this term relevance claim comes from evidence synthesis approaches where we talk about an evidence claim, and particularly from critical appraisal, where critical appraisal is, well, how strong is that evidence claim you're making? So we've coined the expression relevance claim as a specific type of evidence claim where we're claiming relevance to the project. So what's the basis for that claim? Does the evaluation say, okay, here's the evidence I'm providing to show the relevance claim I'm making? And the levels we've got is not stated. So they don't explain why, there's no basis given. So they say, okay, general assertion, this program is aligned with government priorities. And they just say that. There's no basis given for that claim. It's there is a claim, but we don't know the basis for that claim. The second is documents. So they refer to a particular strategy. We're assuming we take it on trust they've read that document and they know that what they're doing does fit with that document. So often when they're citing a policy or strategy, you'll find, okay, the basis of the claim is documents. The final versions, they might basis of claim, they might have done interviews. They've gone and spoken to stakeholders. Okay, is this relevant? I hope they didn't ask that question. That'd be a leading question, but they asked questions that would lead to identification of whether this is relevant or not. And we distinguish between non-comparative and comparative, because non-comparative would just say, is this relevant? Oh, it's relevant. Comparative would say, is this the most relevant thing you could do? We're going to tackle youth employment. Is this the best way of tackling it? Is the way you think it should be tackled? And my motivation for that comes from another piece of work I also did with Sonia. Also, this is a bit more recent. This is 20 years ago, or just over 25 years ago. Oh no, sorry, this is older. The other one was quite recent. This 25 years ago, where we're doing an evaluation of social funds, which are basically community-driven development projects before the name CDD was being used. So money is given to community and it's decided at community level. I won't say it's decided by the community because that's one of the main points in our evaluation. It's decided at community level how that money is going to be spent. And we did household surveys in, I think it was 20 communities in 4 countries where they had social funds. And at the start of those questionnaires, before we ask anything about the social fund or anything else, after we'd done the basic household enumeration, like, name, number of household members, all that little blah, blah, blah stuff, we asked, okay, what are the top priorities in your community? What are the most pressing problems in your community? And we asked for the top 3 communities. I forget how many we asked for, but we got here the top and the top 3. And then we knew what the project was in that village, in certainly in Malawi and Zambia, where I did the field work. It's nearly all schools, and it's not schools, health clinics. In Malawi, it's a bit more diversified, water supply, roads, and so on. In Zambia, nearly all schools and occasionally health clinics. And so we checked if what the project had done was in the top priority or in the top 3 priorities of the household of the villagers. And you'll see it was in the top priority of the villagers less than a third of the time, around a quarter of the time, and it was in the top 3 priorities less than half the time. So, but if we asked them, oh, did you appreciate what was done? They said, oh yeah, there's a good thing. We like this. We're happy this was done. So if you ask the question, a non-comparative question, oh, did you think it was a good thing? They'll say yes. So non-comparative relevance, it's there. But if you think, is this what you would have done? Then it's not there for most people, not even top 3 priority for most people. So the non-comparative relevance is a higher bar because you're saying, is this the thing you really, really, for those of my age who know the Spice Girls, you're not asking, is this what you want? You're asking, is this what you really, really, really want? Okay. And so we include in our coding form this comparison and non-comparison. So I'm going to hand over to Diana now, who will introduce herself and then go through his examples from the coding frame and then present some results. Diana, over to you, and let me know when you want to change the slide.
Thank you. Good afternoon, you all. My name is Diana Dazi. I'm a Senior Research Associate at the Research and Evaluation Center. So I'm making a presentation as a rep of the Ghana team, and this coding by the Ghana team was done by myself and my other colleague, Madeline Autry. Madeline is on the call. More, can we see you briefly before I proceed?
Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. This is Madeline, also from the Ghana office. Thank you.
Thank you, Maud. Okay, so as Prof has already given the intro, I will delve straight into explaining how the coding was done, depending on the text we found in the evaluations. So as the first slide shows, the first evaluation report was by ILO. This evaluation narrative clearly told us the intervention was motivated by the social and economic situation of the stakeholders, and then the opportunities for meaningful benefits to the stakeholders, as well as the need to strengthen cultural stakeholders. So clearly, it was beneficial to stakeholders because it had been named clearly. And so in terms of relevance to who it was coded beneficiary, and then it did not go further to give any in-depth explanation of the exact need it was trying to resolve. It didn't tell us any policy initiative or priority area it is aligned with. So this was basically a general assertion. And so on specificity, it was coded general assertion. Given that it was a general assertion, there was no basic for that claim. And so when it came to that coding, it was coded not stated. In that same text, we also see a mention of how the intervention was of a priority to the national planning efforts. It went further to cite the exact national planning effort it was in alignment with. So being in alignment with the national planning efforts, when it came to who the intervention was relevant to, it was the government. And then when it came to specificity, because it had proceeded to explain the exact intervention it was aligned with, it was coded site policy it was aligned with. And then when it came to the basis for the claim, having given the exact policy or national priority area it was aligned with, the basis was the document it referenced. Another study we looked at here is a UNDP study. So in this study, it was clearly mentioned the goal of the intervention was relevant to China and the world. So clearly, it was relevant to China as a country, and then the world being global. However, this was a general assertion in that it didn't go on to tell us which national priority area it was aligned with or which global policy or strategy it was aligned with. Hence, when it came to coding specificity, this was coded a general assertion with no basis for the claim. So the same trend was used for the rest of the studies. As we can see here, UNICEF study clearly stated it was aligned with a government's priority area, and it cited the exact document it was aligned with, and so it was coded as such. It cited a policy, and then the policy document became the basis for the coding under basis. Thank you. Next. So it should also be noted that each test had multiple relevance claims. So it wasn't like one text was to one claim. There were instances, as we can see with the ILO study, where a text showed a relevance claim to different stakeholders. Howard, please, can you move to the next slide? Okay, so I'm delving straight to findings from the analysis. So this coding was done by myself. And then, so on the first code, that was who the intervention was relevant to, we saw that most relevance claims were made to countries. That is to say, the interventions were either relevant to a government priority area, a government strategy, a national effort, or something. Yes, so we saw a slight increase in the claims from 38% in 2013 to 39% in 2023. This notwithstanding, the claims were spread across all stakeholders, with each stakeholder having at least a 10% claim of relevance to its name. Next, please. So when it came to findings from the coding on specificity, we realized that general assertions to relevance declined sharply from 55% to 20%. And then citation of documents surged up from 14 to 55%. This is a clear indication of evaluators being intentional and then grounding their evaluation claims on formal frameworks and evidence rather than making general assertions of relevance. Next, please. And then when it came to the basis of relevance claims, the use of unstated basis remained high. So from the previous slide, we saw that general assertions were high. And given that general assertions to relevance were high, then it's a good reflection of this assessment showing unstated basis were also high. Okay, so I will also proceed to speak on findings from the World Bank assessment. So this coding was done by my colleague Maudlin, and then the results showed that relevance was claimed. So claims to relevance to government entities were dominate. So this is similar to findings from the UNDP assessment. Yes, most evaluations were relevant to national priorities. They were relevant to government strategies and policies. So this is not so different from findings from UNDP. Again, we see funding agency and beneficiaries both accounted for 1/5 of relevant claims. it is worth noting that the claim made to funding agencies increased from 15% to 22%. Yes, and this doesn't come again as a surprise, knowing that funders are becoming more keen on designing interventions that are aligned with their own internal goals and strategies. Okay, so when it came to coding on specificity, general assertion, as similar to the UNDP assessment, had also been replaced with citing of policy evidence. So here again, we see a change in trend of people making general claims of relevance to them citing specific policies and strategies that are aligned with the interventions, which is a good sign. Next, please. Now, when it came to the basis for whatever claims on evidence that was made, no stated basis remained dominant. So this means that there is still more work to be done. More evaluation claims need to be grounded in evidence and formal frameworks. We saw not stated, we saw a little decline in not stated from 76% to 60%. However, the percentage is still high and there is more room for improvement when it comes to claims made to relevance. Thank you. I'll hand over to the next presenter at this time. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hi. Can anyone hear me? Okay, I'm Xiaoman from Center for Evidence-Based Social Science of Lanzhou University. Me and my colleague Pan Bei, we joined this project and doing the ILO and the UNICEF coding. Please hand to Pan Bei.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bei Pan, a PhD student from Center for Evidence-Based Social Science of Lanzhou University, and thank you. Xiaoman, please.
Okay. Okay, let us begin with the ILO finding. So the first one is the relevant to who. We find in both 2013 and 2023, the most frequently cited level or of relevance were the country level and the partner or institution level, followed by beneficiaries actually. And there was increase in references to the global level in 2023. However, the funding agency level, actually, they are very limited mentioned. So, and also no report from 2023 include in this level. Additionally, there are two reports in 2023 did not mention any like statement or description about relevance in 2023. Yes, and about the specificity, there has been a substantial shift towards more specific relevance claim in ILO evaluations, where previous report often relied on general statement. Recent evaluation provide greater details and prescience. Next, please. And about the basis for relevant claim. In 2013, over 40% of report failed to state the basis for the relevance claim, but by 2023, the figure dropped to 22%. Meanwhile, the proportion of claims supported by policy document or project report rose from just under 50 to 65%. Next, please. And about UNICEF, the ILO coding is responsible for Pan Bei and I doing the UNICEF coding. The UNICEF coding the first category is about relevant to who. The pattern is broadly consistent across the 2-time period. Relevance is most commonly addressed at the country level, partner or institution level, and beneficiary level. 2 reports in 2030 and 1 in 2023 failed to mention relevance altogether. Next, please. And about the specificity, both the 2030 and 2023 report offer details and specific accounts regarding the specificity of the relevance claim, provide explicit detail about how allegement was achieved. Compared with 2030, the proportion of general assertion in the 2023 report has decreased. And the next one is based of a relevant claim. Actually, most claim both 2013 and 2023 evaluation tended to include details and explicit relevance claim. Also, in addition, the UNICEF report adopted more comparative approaches in their analysis, although the proportion of report based on interview and comparative method decreased in 2023. So actually, we try to compare 4 agencies' differences of relevance, like in the different categories. So the first one, what we find, so about the relevant to who is the first one, what banks stand out, the mainly claim relevance to country or government, followed by funding agency and not much else. And second one is, in most cases, country government is the most important categories, followed by partner and institution. And third one is, the differences between agencies are greater than any change over time for each agency. And the next comparison. Next, please. Next is specificity. There is a lot of variation between agencies with respect to specificity. With UNICEF mostly give specific details, and other agencies state specific policy. The use of general assertion has mostly failed over time, especially ILO and World Bank, actually. Next, please. About the basis for relevance claim, not giving the basis for relevance claim is most common, notably for UNDP and World Bank. Documentary evidence is the next most common, and there is little reliance on interviews, other than for UNICEF, and virtually no use of comparative evidence from interviews. So based on, we compare the 2030 and we compare the same agencies, but by change over time, and then we change the different 4 agencies key finding. We find the general finding is the height of the bar is not as low as feared, and it has got higher over time. Notable improvement in more specific evidence claim. Those bases for the claim remain unstated in many cases. The height of the bar varies between agencies. UNICEF stands out as a high level of specificity with a state basis for the evidence claim. So after we coding and we discuss our finding, we want to give those discussion points. Like the first, should funding agency be included in DAC relevance criteria? And is there a role for comparative relevance claim? If so, how can it be actioned? And is there a hierarchy in terms of relevant to whom, or should each evaluation assess relevance to all categories? And is there a need for a new guideline in application of the DAC category criteria to increase uniformity? And the majority of agencies do not give an rating. For example, like highly relevant and relevant, marginally relevant and not relevant. Should they do so? Should they do so, or would be the criteria? Next, please. And thanks for your attention. Please, I will now hand it back to Shrita for the Q&A session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. This was really interesting. And we do have, quick questions in the chat. The first one, I think they are all interrelated questions, so probably it would be helpful to reflect on each of these. The first question is from Anna, and she mentions that the relationship between relevance and effectiveness in developmental interventions deserve a deeper scrutiny. And she further highlights that many evaluations reveal that programs lacking relevance to beneficiaries tend to be less effective, raising concerns about how this connection is addressed in evaluation reviews. Additionally, there appears to be a growing trend where donor evaluation client prioritizes internal relevance, aligning interventions with their own country policy objective to secure funding over external relevance to developing countries, government, and communities. This approach obviously risks lowering the bar for relevance, specifically within AIDS cuts, making it harder to uphold even the most minimal interpretation of OECD DAC criteria. Her question is, has the link between relevance and effectiveness been examined in evaluation reviews? And have you noticed a growing emphasis on internal relevance over external relevance in donor evaluations, and how this shift impacted the developmental outcomes?
Okay, thank you. I think that's a number of good points there. I'm clearly on the first point, or amongst the first points. If a program is not relevant to the needs and interests of the targeted beneficiaries, it's very unlikely to have an effect because they're not going to engage with the program, and that's a common problem. And it might be picked up by the relevance assessment. It might not get picked up. There's a general assumption on the part of people developing programs that the intended beneficiaries are just sitting around waiting for them to come, someone to come and develop them. And that's simply not true at all. They're out there living their lives, doing their stuff. Yes, and they'll only take part in development programs if the perceived benefits of those programs exceed the perceived costs. And we often overstate the benefits to underestimate the costs. And so we sort of probably assume a relevance is not there. I think you'll find the relevance to intended beneficiaries is rarely, if ever, assessed by actually going and asking them. Yes, so the relevance of intended beneficiaries is nearly always going to be at the level of general assertion. Oh, this is going to be good for them, and that's not for us to say. Okay, that's for them to say. And so I think that that disconnect between what people want and what aid donors want to give them is a very important point. There was something on LinkedIn this morning that annoyed me a lot, where Rachel Glenister, former JPOW, is saying we should only focus on best buys of things shown to work. I don't spend money on these best buys projects shown to work by RCTs. That would take us back to the 1960s, a very top-down, project-driven approach of just here you have to do this project, and totally throughout the window over 20 years now, focusing on building systems and system development and local ownership and all that stuff that's meant to be in the Paris Gender, Accra Accords, etc. So, and so being serious about relevance to the beneficiaries is a very important point. And so I think you're also right. I mean, the area in which I work, which is mainly research and evaluation, there's definitely been a trend towards funders being more focused on the things they want to do. And that's true of the new funders. So if we look at the foundations, with some notable exceptions, but say take Gates Foundation, it's very much they know what they want, and that's what they will fund. Yes, I mean, so this rise of foundation funding, which we might see as a good thing because lack of declines in bilateral, multilateral funding, but actually it's far more traditional project aid. I mean, I've worked with Gates Foundation since my 3IE days, and I used to sit and think, did they never look at the history of development aid and like how that's evolved over time and learn something from that, because they really do use traditional project-based approaches, and the vertical funds that they support and so on have learned nothing from the need to work in existing national systems and so on. And so this talk's not meant to be just me a rant to my pet peeves, but these are important issues. And so so I did say I don't think it's a bad thing that evaluations ask, was this intervention aligned with the priorities of the funder itself? Because you sort of think it should be, but they'd say also it shouldn't be the only thing they look at. And so the extent to which funder priorities are going to determine what's going to get funded I do think it's a bad thing. So, I'm British. So the UK has announced it's going to cut aid. It was 0.7%, then 0.5, now it's going down to 0.35. And there was a ministerial statement last week or the week before saying this means we're going to have to focus our aid. And what she said was we're going to focus on climate change. When the aid cuts were announced by the Prime Minister, who already said we're going to focus our aid on helping countries deal with climate change and health, and mainly to try and fight global pandemics. We're going to have to, that means we're going to drop some things, and we're going to drop education and gender. That's not a choice coming from developing countries and the countries who are receiving British aid. That's a choice made by the British government. And so, forget about ownership and partnership, all that stuff, which I've always argued donors aren't serious about, so I'm not surprised. But clearly, if you're working in an NGO whose purpose is to improve girls' access to schooling, don't go asking for money from FCDO, because those priorities are like out the window now. And that's just a central decision that's been made. Okay, back to you, Ashrita. What question next?
Great. So thank you. And I think this is again a related question, but I'll speak about that anyway. So when we say that, relevance need to be based on some formal, criteria or national level policy, we are definitely overlooking the community level needs. And there are a lot of programs, for example, if we talk about, assessing something on education and we're aligning it with national education policy, it might be overlooking the local community needs. For example, there might be teacher shortages and the policy is not aligned for that. So does that mean when we're evaluating, we have to overlook the superficial, nature of the relevance? And there's a question where it mentions that how can evaluators navigate this conflict between donor defined or policy level, national policy level defined relevance to the real world needs rather than institutional expectations? And maybe how can we make it more meaningful rather than a checkbox exercise? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and that's sort of what motivates doing this piece of research, is to try and get that discussion taken seriously by the donors. So I didn't invite anyone from the DAC to this talk, and I think when we've done a bit more work on it, I'll try and get to present it to the DAC secretariat, maybe in the evaluation working group, and try to get them to talk about this issue, because this is absolutely the point. I mean, it's even at the level of the government. So the example from Government of Scotland Youth Employment Initiative, I think illustrates this point very nicely, that just saying, oh, it's a priority issue is not enough. You've got to align with what the government actually wants to do, which they dismally failed to do in that case. But the point you're making, and I agree entirely, is what's being stated as a priority at the national level, or the way in which you want to address that need at the national level, might not at all correspond with the perceived priority down at the local level. So to take the work that I cited, that I did with Sonia in the social funds, if you go in the African context, most villages you go to, they're going to ask for jobs. They ask for employment opportunities. That's the number one priority. Okay, and that's something that social funds don't do. They provide a bit of temporary work, but actually in social funds that's meant to be voluntary labour. So even the work you get is not compensated. A public works program would do that. Public works sorry, I'm going my hobby horses again now. Public works are really not popular in sub-Saharan Africa. We do work on youth employment, but evidence maps and reviews on youth employment, and they've done in a post-crisis setting. Outside of South Africa, there's expanded program public works. You don't see public works programs in sub-Saharan Africa outside of crisis settings. You see cash transfers. You give people money, and that's very fashionable for donors. But public works, giving people money in terms of actually building some useful infrastructure, it's never taken off. And I blame the World Bank for that. I blame the World Bank for a lot of things. I blame the World Bank for that because the World Bank really picked up the idea of cash transfers, and they helped pay for the first cash transfers in Latin America. So they've been really pushing the idea in across the world. And they've never really been behind a big successful public works scheme. There is one, and REGA in India. Really big, successful public works scheme that has a big role in alleviating poverty, but it's never gone asking for money from the World Bank, and so the World Bank's never picked it up, saying, "Oh, here's a program we ought to be looking at and learning from and replicating in other countries." And I'm mentioning it now just because if you go to the villages in most, from the experience I had and the work we did in sub-Saharan Africa, primary need is looking for employment. And the REGA scheme in India guarantees each poor household, and they have a scheme, we have below poverty line cards, each poor household 100 days work a year. So it's guaranteed to bring money into poorer households through work. And so it's answering that met need, and it's not doesn't get considered. I'll give just one other example of this. So Sonia and I worked on the social funds evaluation. Then a few years later, when I was at also still in IEG at the World Bank, there was a community-driven development evaluation as well. So of these funds, and a part of that, they looked at joint forestry projects. And this was in India, and so as part of joint forest management, the village got some money they could use any way they wanted. And a colleague of mine, I won't name, came to show me some results because he thought it was funny that one of the villages had used the money they had from the forest to buy some crockery. And he thought this was funny. I think that's brilliant. So in a village, when you have a wedding and your daughter's going to get married, you have to have a wedding party, you actually have to have crockery for the whole village. And poor households can't afford to do that. So buying some village crockery to use at these wedding parties was a brilliant idea. And no donor would ever have thought of that or ever have paid for that. So I certainly never thought of that, but the villagers themselves thought that's a good way to use this money. And so if you have a fund which was genuinely allowed the villages to say, oh, you want to use money for this, then you get their real needs emerging and you can meet their real needs. And that doesn't happen in 99.99% development funding, which stays anywhere in the capital city or in the regional centres, doesn't reach rural areas, and certainly doesn't respond to villagers' needs. And so there really is a need to think seriously about turning aid around to really meet the needs of poor people. And I'm not a huge defender of local NGOs either. I don't think they necessarily do this any better than do external development partners. They also can have their own agendas and things they want to do. So I think that the question is very good one, and it's a crucial challenge for the development community to think how to do it better. And go back to the topic, for evaluations to really ask those questions, to know if was this intervention really doing what the people it's intended to benefit wanted. And that goes back to making using comparative interviews, which, as we've seen, are barely used.
Great, thank you, Dr. Ovid. So there's another question, and I think this is more around whether it would help if the relevance were assessed directly by the people who are affected rather than the evaluators or the agency. And probably a question that I would like to add here is, would it be better if the relevance is integrated with other DAC criteria, such as coherence and sustainability? And what benefits or the downside does it have? It happens if it is integrated with that rather than only based on relevance.
Right. I've forgotten the first bit now. So what you added on? What was the first bit?
Okay, so the first bit was, would it be better if the relevance were assessed directly by the people affected rather than evaluated?
Yeah, that is what I was just discussing. So I don't think exclusively so, but that certainly should be there. And as we've seen, it usually isn't, because interviews are rarely used that require interviews. So certainly general assertion doesn't do that. Documentary evidence generally won't do that, because documentary evidence is alignment for policy or so on. It's not talking about what the people wanted. And the earlier question reflected very clearly that what's in official policy and so on, even what's down at community level, may not reflect what the people as a whole want. So just again to digress on the findings for social funds evaluation, the same kind with CTD evaluation. Social funds in Zambia are 80% schools, not just because schools are needed in rural areas in Zambia, which they are. There's no doubt. It is a thing that's needed, but because it's what we call a prime mover. The person initiating accessing the social funds and the person with actually the bridge, we'll call the bridging capital, the connection to the people who provide those money, is the head teacher. And so the head teacher actually is the person that initiates getting the social fund money coming into the village. And of course, he wants to have a new school rehabilitation. It's not a new school, it's a rehabilitated school, and actually new teacher housing. So he has a strong incentive to do it. And so it's not a community decision. The community was called together to be told, we're going to have a new rehabilitated school, we're going to get money for it, and you all need to come and make bricks. So the community, there was, despite the what I call the hippie model of social funds, that the community decides on the priority, that's not what happened. Okay, it was very clear from our community level work, that's not what happened. And it's shown very clearly from our household survey as well, the qualitative data collection. And so there's a mismatch between the way in which community priorities get expressed and what the people themselves actually want. And that's what motivated us doing the survey that we did and asking about priorities, knowing about that. And so yes, entirely. I think more interviews about relevance to the people who are meant to benefit would be a really good idea. And I hope that's something that will come out of this piece of work to recommend that. Only UNICEF does the interviews, and mainly with stakeholders like project staff and so on, not of intended beneficiaries. But UNICEF, there's a lot of pages discussing relevance. That's something we didn't report the coding from. We're going to look at. Often relevance is like 1 or 2 paragraphs in World Bank reports. In UNICEF, it's like 10 pages. So they have a very detailed discussion of like relevance of different groups and so on, including beneficiaries. Linking the criteria together, I can see the logic, but in the end, I also see a quite compelling logic keeping them separate. But when you're assessing relevance, you can say, with respect to what's expected to have sustained positive impact. Yes, so relevance is not just about, is it something that was wanted by people, or was it something that we thought was a good thing, that was going to work and have sustained benefits wanted by people.
Okay, great. We don't have any more questions in the chat, so please put your questions in the chat. In the meantime, people are thinking. I just want to add one quick thing on the relevance part. So, do you think the current digital innovations in terms of technology and data analytics, it ensures that relevance or the assessment of relevance remains dynamic and responsive as compared to, say, the traditional methods? And how does it really help in, say, unpredictable context, like humanitarian emergencies or global crises, where digital innovation might not reach because of the constraints of or access to digital innovation? So does it have any implications to be considered?
Okay, so there are two questions there. One you're not asking, but I'm going to answer. So the revision of adapt criteria added this thing about adapting to changing circumstances. We didn't actually assess that, and maybe we should have done. We've coded everything that's said. We've extracted data on everything they said on relevance, so we can still add that code about where there was adaptation. And my suspicion would be that they still don't do that so well. It was the finding that we had in the RAP for the World Bank and country policy frameworks, that relevance didn't really assess very well changing circumstances. And then that was certainly true in the Scottish case I cite, because by the time they got around to agreeing what they're going to do and putting in place a very complicated procurement mechanism, things had changed, and the need had changed from what was agreed to be done. So there's definitely a need to take account of the way in which circumstances change. And you're right, humanitarian settings, that's a clear example where it's commonly understood that there is an immediate post-disaster relief need, but that's fairly short-lived. And then you want to think about making sure that children still get immunised on routine immunisation schedule, that children are actually being educated, that there's work opportunities for people, and those sort of things. So moving from relief to development, which has been the rhetoric for over 20 years now, but happens very poorly. And so you'll find post-disaster programs overly focused on relief and don't recognise that, oh no, we need to be transitioning to a development phase. And so that's an obvious example, but there are other examples. I mean, so the first impact evaluation done by IG, it wasn't done by me. I've got his name now. Was on the Kenyan Agricultural Extension Program, and that found that farmers were going out and they found there was no impact in the extension program, this training and visit program, and that was because the extension service were giving advice to farmers to adopt practices they'd already adopted, and that could have been found out pretty quickly by a proper monitoring system, and so the program could have reacted to that, and the evaluation could have pointed to basically both a failure to find out what's going wrong earlier on and a failure to adapt accordingly. And so even though the training visit, like the idea was that the farmer, the program funded agricultural research stations, the farmers, the extension workers were meant to learn from the research being on the research station, which didn't happen. And then they're meant to give that advice to the farmers, but the farmers were doing the stuff that's being advised. So it's one of those things that looks relevant on the face of it, but actually the way it was played out, they weren't learning these lessons, they weren't telling farmers stuff they didn't know already. It wasn't relevant at all. And so that's a good example of a dynamic setting where the evaluation really needs to take account of what was actually happening and the way in which circumstances, the farmers knew this stuff, but they didn't know the start of the program. They did by the time the program was up and running. Needs to be taken into account. Using AI to help with this, I think it's really contextual, because sometimes I could see that there might be ways in which AI can help. But in the settings I'm normally thinking of, resource poor African settings, or even resource poor Indian settings, where South Asian settings, where digital technology is more advanced. Actually, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So digital penetration in South Asia is very high, and so there is potentially somewhere you might be able to use, and by that I mean mobile phones, yes. And so in Africa, Android phones still are not that pervasive. You still have quite a lot of use of people have text, but they have old style phones. So the sort of apps you might want to use would probably be Android based, and in South Asia you could probably get away with that. So in terms, I'm thinking like data collection, trying to identify changing needs and so on, that at the project level as well as relevance level. So if the projects that are trying to respond to beneficiary needs down at grassroots level, which should be every project, can actually find ways to use digital technology to better shape what they're doing. And if you've got and the advantage of AI is you can do stuff fairly free form. So if you go back 5 years, you'd have to give people like a list, what's called a positive list. Here's a list of things you might want, pick your top 3. Now people can just give me 500 words of what you want in any language. And AI will just take it for you and say, here, I've synthesized it. Yes. And so there's lots of opportunity there, both for evaluators and program designers to just use those technologies to harness individual level inputs of what people actually want.
Great. I think we have 10 more minutes, and I don't see any questions in the chat. Maybe Ziomi and Diana, do you want to comment on any of these questions and share your insights? Okay, so I see that as a no. Probably.
No, no one just came in. Ashrita. Oh, it's not just about relevance. It's a question about funders not wanting to have critical evaluations, and that is not that varies by agency. I'm very open in saying this. So back in the 1990s, I did a lot of work for the Swedish government. They love being criticised. That's all I can say. They're like, oh, we've been so bad. That's how bad we've been. Yes, we're very bad Swedes, and they're totally open to hearing criticism of the way things were done. And there's yes, we acknowledge these problems. They're very serious, the Swedes. They're a very, very serious problem you have, yes. Whereas the European Union, you can't say a single critical thing about anybody. So if you say a critical thing about the Union evaluation, it will just never work for them again. And even a recent piece of work I did with the European Union, which is synthesis, and I was quoting critical statements from evaluations, and they asked me to remove them. And they said, oh, we don't want to be critical of other agencies. And I said, but these are quotes from their own evaluations. Can't we keep them in? They're saying it themselves about themselves. So no, we don't want to be critical of our partners. Like that's willingness to learn is just like forget about it. It's nowhere. So you've got. I see it on LinkedIn. And I certainly write it. People who are advertising, they say, "Oh, here's the terms of reference for an evaluation," and the terms of reference are the evaluation will show the benefits of and how great it is and what a wonderful program is. That's not an evaluation. That's a PR exercise. Okay, you want to hire a PR firm, not an evaluation firm, if that's your terms of reference. All right. So there's a lot of bias in evaluations. One of the things I write about, there are a lot of bias in evaluation. But one of the strongest biases comes from funders wanting you not to say critical things. And the defense of that is, I mean, there's one discussion something I blogged on of integrity versus independence, and I always think independence is overrated. It's integrity that matters. So you just stand by your integrity as an evaluator, and the way to do that is evidence standards. So coming from systematic reviewing over the background of the last 10 years now, I've really become to understand that the importance of evidence standards. I gave a talk quite some years ago now at IEG after I'd left IG and when I was still working at 3IE about, I think, or maybe just start working at Campbell, about what basically, what can evidence synthesis learn from evaluation? A lot of what I know about evidence synthesis, I learned doing evaluations at the World Bank because they do them in a different way to most people, and it's very systematic. But a lot of but in saying what can the evaluation learn from systematic review, the main thing was critical appraisal. Evaluations don't do critical appraisal. And the main thing about critical appraisal is confidence in your evidence finding. So here's an evidence finding. How confident am I that that is a valid finding? And the main way we assess confidence is, well, what were your methods? And for qualitative studies in particular, it's just tell me your methods, because they don't report the methods. And so here's a finding. Oh, farmers liked the program. Well, how do you know that? Back actually going back to IEG, Bob, when I started working there, and Bob Paccioccio was still the Director General who set up IEG, set up what was then OED. And when Bob read a report and it said something like, oh, the majority of donors favor this approach. How many donors? Out of how many you asked? How did you ask them? Every time Bob would like, how many? Out of how many? And so that's a really important lesson. And it's about being clear what your evidence is. If you look at my blog on 10 common flaws in evaluation, one is unsubstantiated evidence claims. So basically, you've got to say what your evidence is very clearly and how you collected it, where it came from. And so this is answering the question. So if a funder says, no, we don't like what you've said, I can stand by that because this is my evidence. Okay, this is strong evidence. I've told you how I collected this. I've told you what I was going to do. That's what I did. What I said I was going to do in my inception report. I told you I was going to interview these people. I said I was going to speak to these stakeholders. I know you told me not to speak to those stakeholders, but I ignored you because that would have been biased. I spoke to stakeholders that I identified as relevant, not just the ones you wanted me to speak to. And I spoke to them, and this is the story we get. Okay, and this is what I'm telling you is consistent with what we found from speaking to our sample of stakeholders. So if you can stand by your findings, then you have to stand by them and not. You've got a solid basis for not giving in and revising what you say, and that's why clear, explicit criteria for relevance claim matter. So that's why in the slide, last slide Xiaoman presented, we had, should there be clear criteria for making a specific relevance claim, highly relevant, relevant, partially relevant, not relevant, which is like the World Bank scale. And I think we should have that. And we should have basically criteria by which we rate at those different levels of relevance. Because then when you make a relevance claim, you've got criteria used to make it. It doesn't seem like a subjective judgment. So, and then that will be backed up by some increased guidance. So, and this really does come from my experience as a reviewer, is feeling we need to be really explicit about our methods and apply clear standards in making these claims. And then they're less questionable. There's less potential for the funder to come in and say, we don't like what you say, change it.
So Dr. Howard, you mentioned, so high relevance would not necessarily means effectiveness, or it has measured its intended impact, correct?
It's relevance is, are we doing the right thing? Whether actually, I know you say, well, if it doesn't work, you can't be doing the right thing. It's what we thought would be the right thing. Most things don't work. Yes, and yeah, things don't work. So if you look at the impact evidence, it's going to turn out, okay, it didn't work, but it has a small effect, which is the best you can get sometimes. But given the context, given what people wanted, this seemed to be the right thing. That's the question.
Got it. Astra, you have your camera on. Do you want to comment on anything? Quick thing? No. Okay. Great. Okay, perfect. So I think we are just 2 minutes before the closing, and I don't see any more questions. So any final reflection from you, Dr. Howard? Otherwise, we'll close for the day.
No, I'll ask anyone else in the team. Just go around quickly. The other two presenters, Diana and Xiaoman, they want to add anything. Yeah, Diana?
Okay, so I think it's been a very great and informative session. We're happy you all made the time to join. We're happy how interactive you made it, and we really appreciate all the questions. We look forward to continuing with this studies, finalizing it, and then sharing it when another opportunity presents itself. Thank you.
Thanks, Tiana. Ziomi, do you want to add anything?
Not like add something like I think as Howard side like the relevance is do right things. I think the do right things is totally different between do things right. This is what I think, and do right things. It means we have to see back, see from the beginning, see what is our like motivations to do this project, and what is the just from the beginning. But the do things right, it seems like we just follow this arrangement or something else, and we just do the things step by step and just finish or something else. And so this is what I think. That's why relevance is very important. Also, it let
Could you please mute yourself?
yes, and this made me actually from the last recommendation or like our thinking, it makes me think about the grid. Howard, do you know the grid? The grid renting, in the medical area, like we do the highly recommend and the medium recommend. I think it's similar, very similar. I think it's maybe it's a good way to not just relevance, but also other criteria we can do maybe in the future or sometime. Okay, that's all.
Great, thanks, Ziomi. Dr. Howard, any final thoughts from you?
No, that's it.
Great. So
Thank
thank you so
everybody.
much. Yeah, thank you so much, all the speakers. And I hope you will have the opportunity to interact further on the LinkedIn post that came around for this. So if you have questions, please post it there. And if there are any answers or anything, I think you can also email the speaker here to get more information. Thank you so much for your time today. It was a wonderful session. At least I learned a lot for this session and looking forward to many more on these topics. Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Bye.